the History with Jackson podcast.
So hello and welcome to the History of Jackson podcast, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you in an accessible and digestible way. So hello everyone and welcome back to the podcast. Today we welcome author and historian Nicola Clark to talk about her book, The Waiting Game, the untold story of the women who served the Tudor Queens. Now I'm super excited to talk about this for one of two reasons. One, the book was absolutely awesome and I learned so much from it. And secondly, Nikki taught me at university, so I'm very happy to talk to Nikki about her work, which I know she was working on when I was studying under her. So how are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, the shoe is on the other foot today. You can quiz me.
Yeah, it feels very weird now. So hopefully I do all right. So the first question I want to ask you, Nikki, is what inspired you to write this book?
My last book, actually, which is often the way, I think, for historians and writers. You're writing one thing and then you come across something else that immediately you're like, but that's a whole other thing. Well, that's clearly the next project. So when I was writing about the Howard women during Henry VIII's reign, I wrote a chapter about them as courtiers, and I wanted to put them into context, like a women at court, ladies in waiting. And I thought, wait, the context just didn't really exist in the way that I needed it to. And I thought, well, okay, then I'll have to write it. And as I was doing the research for that, it occurred to me that probably quite a lot of people would be interested in ladies in waiting, and maybe I should write this for a broader audience. So I did.
And that sounds like the tale as old as time for historians, that the book wasn't there, so you just went, sod it, I'll write it myself. So I quite like that, I think, and I like that your research is all lined up to this book itself. But we've mentioned the term lady in waiting. Who is a lady in waiting? How are they appointed? What is their role at court?
So a lady in waiting now and then is really a woman who is appointed to serve the Queen in any way that she requires. So they accompany the Queen to events. They are with her most of the time, wherever she is. They keep her company. Sometimes they're her confidants, so they hear her secrets. But they're also, especially in a pre-modern sense, designed to be her chaperones as well. So they are there to make sure that the Queen is not, left in a compromising position or something like that. But also, if the Queen is going to do something that she shouldn't be doing, you can bet that at least one lady in waiting is going to know about it. So it can be quite a tricky position to negotiate.
And I think that's really interesting that they're able to help the Queen out, but often there's different situations where they might have split loyalties. So how did ladies in waiting in the Tudor period kind of try to manage the loyalty towards the Queen, but also maybe loyalties that they had towards their families or their country? Because not all the ladies in waiting in this period are English.
Yeah, that's true. So if the Queen is not English, then not all of her women are going to be English either. Foreign princesses or future Queen consorts would bring women with them from their country of origin, and some of those women would stay behind in England, potentially for the rest of their lives. So yes, not all ladies in waiting are all of one nationality, and it does create some potential difficulties with loyalties and with negotiating those. I think through Henry's reign, ladies in waiting are really walking a kind of tightrope that they've just not really had to negotiate on as many fronts as this before. That feels like a very mixed metaphor. But you see what I mean? So yes, for a lady in waiting, what's more important? What her birth family want her to do, what her husband and his family want her to do, what the Queen wants her to do, what the King wants her to do, or what she wants to do, or sort of any combination, what her country wants to do. Those could all be different things, and then she has to try and negotiate a pathway through all of those competing demands.
And I think one set of women around, particularly Catherine of Aragon's ladies in waiting, I found them particularly interesting. So how did Catherine and her ladies in waiting, such as Maria de Salinas, how did they navigate a world where Catherine has been married, then isn't married, but they're still her ladies in waiting, and then is again married, but this time as a queen?
That's a really difficult period. It's not unusual for a queen to be widowed, but it is unusual for her to end up in quite the kind of limbo position that Catherine of Aragon did. Her father, Ferdinand of Aragon, and her father-in-law, Henry VII of England, are arguing about money, basically, and Catherine of Aragon becomes this diplomatic pawn. So Henry VII says, well, look, you didn't pay all of her dowry. I'm not going to marry her off to anyone else, never mind my second son, or send her home until you do that. And Ferdinand says, oh, but I need time. Oh, but you want to. And Catherine is just stuck in the middle and there's nothing she can do. But that means that her ladies-in-waiting are stuck there with her, trying to negotiate this bizarre level of poverty for a queen. I mean, for normal people in England at this time, they are not poor. We should just say that. This is kind of elite poor. So, we can't afford velvet anymore. Oh, God. But a queen is expected to dress herself and her household commensurate with her status. So she is supposed to look and act like a princess or a queen, and the people around her are supposed to do that too, or they lose respect. It also makes Spain look bad if they're not actually clothing their people properly. But for the ladies-in-waiting, it's really difficult. And I think we have this image of ladies-in-waiting being super loyal to whichever queen they're serving. And sometimes that was true. But at this time, actually, a lot of Catherine of Aragon's Spanish women just wanted to get the hell out and go home. And you can understand why that would be. It must have been pretty horrible to be in a strange country and then know that you're not really welcome anymore, but you also can't go home. The only way that they could go home was to have a marriage arranged for them back home. And that's what a number of them are trying to get during this time. And some do manage to get out and go home. But some, and Maria de Salinas is one of them, she is writing back home to her family, desperately trying to get them to pull their fingers out and sort this out. But match after match falls through. So, it's a really difficult time.
You mentioned the idea of marriage. How do ladies-in-waiting in conjunction with their queen, how are they able to navigate that? Because, again, you've mentioned loyalties there. It's quite a difficult world trying to find a marriage which is befitting of their status, but also something that their queen might accept.
There's an enduring myth, I think, that when ladies-in-waiting get married, they leave court and stop being a lady-in-waiting. Sometimes, yes, that was true, but often that wasn't the case. Some women continued to hold their jobs even after they were married. And I think that would just depend on a number of factors. How far away her husband's lands were. Is he also in service at court? In which case it makes sense for her to stay too. Does the queen really rely on her? Possibly. Maria de Salinas is one who eventually did marry an English nobleman and kept her position at court and stayed there really until she was sent away in the 1530s during the royal divorce. Whether you need your monarch's permission to marry is there's no overwritten rule about that. But for the Spanish ladies-in-waiting, it was normal for the queen to give them some money, to give them part of their dowry in order to marry. That was standard. It wasn't standard in the English court. So for the Spanish women, I think it probably is tacitly understood that you would need your monarch's permission in order to marry. She would need to approve of the match. And they are a bit nervous of asking her if it's not all perfectly lined up. They don't go to her with a maybe. Maria says that in a letter. She's like, no, you need to give me all the details because I cannot go to her unless it's all arranged. So yes, they need her permission, but not always. The English women don't routinely ask the Queen for permission to marry unless they or their husband is royal. Then you do need royal permission.
And you mentioned something interesting within that answer, the primary sources, and Maria de Salinas mentioning her relationship with Catherine in her letters. How important were those primary sources for you in your study and your writing of this book?
Oh, really crucial. They were an incredible surprise find, really. So when I started to write this, I thought, oh, hang on, I didn't ever pin down who Maria's parents actually were. And you read different books or different secondary sources and you'll get different answers. Nobody on the English side of things had really pinned that down, which makes sense because foreign ladies-in-waiting tend to fall into this gap in scholarship. Once they've left their country of origin, then they're no longer so interesting to the people who stayed there. They don't appear in records there anymore. But equally, English scholars are not likely, or they don't usually cross the channel and go search in Spanish archives. So yeah, they fall into this gap. And so I did a lot of Google rabbit holing, and somebody had written a PhD thesis actually about a guy who turned out to be Maria's brother-in-law. And I was just searching for Salinas for the name, and it came up, and it was in Spanish. So I was using translation sites, got going with the Duolingo. And in a footnote, she said, and his sister-in-law Maria was in service with Catherine of Aragon in England, and she wrote letters. And I was like, wait, what? What? We don't know this in England. So I got in contact with her. We had a conversation. I got some images. I got some help with transcribing and translating them, because the handwriting, old handwriting in English is one thing, but in Spanish on top. And of course, Spanish was not one of the languages I learned at school, predictably. I have some Spanish now because I had to learn some very quickly. But yeah, there are about 20 letters that Maria wrote back to her family in Spain. And they are in the archive at Simancas. And I hesitate to say I found them, because it's not that they were lost. I think that's a common thing historians say, is that, this discovery. No, it's exactly where it was meant to be. We just didn't know about it. And I leaned quite heavily on those in the early chapters about Maria being in England during that weird limbo period where Catherine of Aragon is widowed.
And I think that really shows the importance of the internet now in our craft as historians, and how vital it is for us being able to extend our search to areas that we wouldn't have done 10, 15 years ago. So I think that's a very interesting part of your book, and I really enjoyed reading extracts from those letters. Now, something about ladies in waiting is, particularly in the Tudor period with a king such as Henry, is they often become a subject of his attention. How do these ladies in waiting under the Queen's household, how do they manage that kind of threat, for want of a better word, and how does it affect the household?
I would say that if it runs like an ordinary royal affair was kind of historically tended to run, it wouldn't necessarily have a huge impact. It wasn't uncommon for kings to sleep around. It's not even super uncommon for a king to have a clearly named mistress for a while. It's uncommon for him to keep marrying them. And I think that was really the issue. Henry can't just shag someone. He has to marry them as well. And that, it did cause problems. It caused problems, you can see that particularly between Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn's households. But that's partly because they're negotiating something unprecedented. One wife is being put aside in favour of another. And in the royals, that just doesn't happen very often, especially when you're also trying to change the shape of national religion in order to achieve that. There's just so many factors that go into this. And it does leave ladies in waiting in this really odd situation. Like, it's not even necessarily their choice about whose, side they choose, for want of a better word, because it really depends what connections you have and what the king is going to allow you to do. So there are some women who very firmly, very clearly align themselves with Catherine of Aragon. But if they do it too loudly and too clearly, they will be sent away from court. So Elizabeth Stafford, Duchess of Norfolk, is one of these. And she is quite surprising because she's actually the aunt by marriage of Anne Boleyn. So the rest of her family is at least quietly in support of Anne. And you would expect Elizabeth to fall in with that. And she absolutely does not. She essentially spies for Catherine of Aragon. I have this, I can't prove this, but I have this mental image of her sort of rifling her husband's desk for useful bits of intelligence from the Vatican about how the case is going, because she does pass news like that on to the Queen. How she got it, I mean, that's as plausible as anything else. We don't really know. But she did, and she passes things on, messages of support, but she's too loud about it, and eventually Anne Boleyn does have her dismissed from court. But another noblewoman, Gertrude Blount, Marchioness of Exeter, is much wilier about it. So she also is on Catherine's side, essentially, but she continues to serve at court, to keep her place at court, because she doesn't go around shouting about it. She just kind of quietly passes a lot of information to Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, and she gets news of her husband, who's on the King's Council, who is also kind of quietly wishing this was not happening and that Catherine was still in her position. But most of the men can't do as much about it as women can behind the scenes. So Gertrude Blount gets away with it for much longer.
Then how do they, with those two households going on, Anne's, Catherine's, as there is many a time during Henry's reign, how do they manage that? Because Anne's got one household and Anne's being treated as a queen and Catherine's being moved aside to the other side of the building. How are they managing having two households there, two sets of ladies in waiting?
I think there is probably no one single point of obvious changeover. I think it's a gradual thing. There are several kind of key moments. There's a moment when there is a banquet and Anne is treated as though she is queen, even though Catherine is still around. And then there's the moment where Catherine is sent away, first to the moor and then to a series of fenland castles that are kind of damp and not very nice. I think those are probably trigger moments for shifts in household. When Catherine is sent away, her ladies in waiting are mostly not sent with her. The sources seem to suggest that lots of them have been dismissed, and she retains a much smaller staff with fewer noble women, actually, women from lower down in the social scale instead. A lot of those noble women do continue to keep in touch with her regardless. They're clearly up on the news. You can see from the way they write letters to other people that they've got information, but they are not formally in Catherine's service anymore. Anne Boleyn doesn't get her own attendants, or it's not clear in the sources that she has her own attendants really until fairly late in the early 1530s, when there's a New Year's gift list that lists 5 women that are specifically with the Lady Anne. She probably had servants before that, but this is the first time that we can really clearly see that there is a rival establishment going on. So I think it's gradual with time. Some of Catherine's ladies do move to Anne Boleyn's service. A lot of those are related to Anne in some way, which is what you would expect. I mean, I think it's easy to demonize Anne Boleyn as, the bad one who's taking over from beloved Queen Catherine. But actually, both of these women are victims of patriarchy in different ways. And I think if you were Anne Boleyn, you wouldn't be feeling very secure. You'd be feeling pretty precarious, and you would want women around you who you felt like you could trust, and that would be family and friends. But you'd also want people who were experienced, because Anne was not raised to be queen. She has been in court for a long time, so she has a concept of how things should be done. But she needs experienced ladies in waiting who can make sure she doesn't put a foot wrong in an obvious way.
How are you able to track who formed parts of these households, who were the ladies in waiting for not only Catherine and Anne, but all the other wives of Henry, Catherine, Anne, Catherine and Jane?
With difficulty, to be honest. Like, that was the major question that I started with, was who was in service with who at what time. And a year later, and I had a lot of spreadsheets and a lot of sources, and still not a very kind of statistically meaningful answer to that question. It's really difficult to track because there aren't super clear archival lists of the Queen's households. There are some, but often a list of women or a list of attendants is made for a specified special occasion. So if it's a coronation or a funeral or a christening or something like that, then there might well be a list somewhere of who showed up. But that's a special occasion and numbers tend to be inflated. So all the peeresses in the world will show up for that. That doesn't mean they're ladies in waiting in an everyday sense. So you have to sit with the material long enough and work with the same names for long enough that you're almost, in the end, it sounds terrible, but going off vibes. It's just that they're quite highly tuned vibes. Like, you get a sense for if this lady's been around all the way through this, then actually, yes, she might well be a lady in waiting. But actually, if she's just popped up suddenly, then perhaps not. So yeah, it takes a lot of time, I think, and a lot of knowing the material really well to be able to attempt to track that. I kept records of every single woman I came across in the sources. And I wrote down every source reference to every woman so that I could pull up like an individual career. But even then, I didn't do a kind of real archival deep dive on every single woman, because there are hundreds, and I'd have been there for another 10 years. But I mean, yeah, I have no doubt that there's probably more to be uncovered, because there always is. History's never finished. There's never just one definitive answer.
And that's a lovely phrase, that history's never finished. And considering that there's 6 queens who have all got their own ladies in waiting, I think that makes that task slightly more difficult for you.
Yeah, a little bit. I didn't find a single woman who definitely served all 6 wives. You will find on the internet various claims that this woman or that woman did. I have yet to properly substantiate those. When you really start trying to dig into it, you think, where did that come from? Often it's kind of thin air, a Victorian myth, very commonly. There are some women who served 5 out of 6 wives and, did pretty well to do that, but I've not found one who served all 6.
And we do love Victorian myths and how they have messed with our perceptions. But, that with 6 queens, and we've slightly discussed how there's a transition between Catherine and Anne. Is that a typical transition from one queen to another in terms of ladies in waiting and households? Does that go across the rest of the transitions?
Actually, I would say no. I'd say there might... Is there less turnover between Catherine and Anne than between others? Again, it's difficult to be kind of numerically specific about that. I think turnover between future queens in some ways was more straightforward and more seamless and a bit less traumatic, actually, in some cases, because it was the first time it had happened with Catherine and Anne, and because both women are still alive. I think that did make it much more difficult. But after Anne's execution, the move to Jane Seymour seems to happen without a lot of comment, a lot of argument. It just happens, and it happens very quickly and very smoothly. When Jane dies, there's a gap for a bit. Anne of Cleves being a foreign consort means her household is created for her, and she brings some women from Germany with her. And then she's there for such a short time that when Catherine Howard becomes queen, actually the household remains largely the same, because they've only just created the household for Anne of Cleves. There's no point in disbanding it and doing it completely again. They just make a few kind of shifts so Catherine can get her sisters in, And then between Catherine Howard and Catherine Parr, again, there's a gap. So then Catherine Parr's household is more different, I'd say, from Catherine Howard's, because there's been that gap, so she can bring her own people in. So yeah, it's really depends on the individual circumstances.
What happens to women when they're not required to be a lady in waiting anymore? Some are dismissed, some are just not transitioning through, some leave service. It's quite a defining role, being at court, being part of the Queen's household, being a confidant for the Queen, and then suddenly not. So how does that affect them moving forward?
If there isn't a queen, then yeah, there's no need for a queen's household. So bye-bye, go home. Maybe not for the men. Some of the men seem to be subsumed into the king's household temporarily. But the women, go home. Or sometimes go serve a different member, a different female royal instead. So there's a time, I think it's in the gap between Jane Seymour and Anne of Cleves, and between Catherine Howard and Catherine Parr, where Princess Mary is kicking about. And for at least some of that time, she is in royal favour. So her household bloats a little bit. And you can see from her surviving privy purse expenses that a lot of the peeresses and the aristocratic women are turning their attention to Mary instead as the number one female royal household in lieu of a queen. And that's quite common, because that happens when Elizabeth of York dies much earlier on as well. So yeah, it's not that there are suddenly no women at all. It's almost that they just shift their focus a little bit. There are some women who will just go home. Some women will get married and leave. Some of it's down to individual preference. If a household is disbanded and there's a woman who cannot go home, she usually stays with friends or relatives instead. That happens to Anne Bassett, who is a maid of honour in the 1530s. She'd only been in the job for, a couple of weeks before Jane Seymour dies, and she's out of a job. But the king has taken a fancy to her, and he says, well, I will provide for her. What the king says and what the king does is not always the same thing. So actually, whether money was forthcoming, there's a lot of discussion about that in letters. Like, well, he said this, but we've not actually seen any gold yet. But he sends her to live with another lady in waiting and her husband for a while, because her family are either in France or a little bit later they're under arrest. So yeah, it really depends. If the king likes you, you'll be provided for.
What happens for some of the ladies in waiting who perhaps were, former Catherine ones, former Anna Cleves, foreign ladies in waiting? How are they treated comparatively to the English ladies in waiting, or ones in favour of Henry?
By the time Catherine of Aragon leaves court and Anne Boleyn sort of takes over, there aren't very many Spanish women left at all. Maria de Salinas is still there, but she is married and widowed by that point. So actually, she goes off and lives on her estates, stays in touch with Catherine, but she's fine. She lives her life as any kind of widowed noblewoman would. There are times when foreign ladies in waiting, I think, must have felt kind of different, but not necessarily when their queen is out of favour. There's a time in the 1510s when there is a big riot in London called the Evil May Day riots in 1517. And it is apprentices in London who are rioting, partly, or for one reason why they're rioting, is because they are afraid that foreigners are taking their jobs. I mean, plus ça change, xenophobia in England. And it's a fairly big riot. It doesn't ever reach the court, but I think the king is quite scared that it might. And he cracks down on the offenders with really undue severity, much more so than normal. And eventually some of them are pardoned, allegedly, because Catherine of Aragon goes down on her knees and begs for mercy. It probably in a pre-choreographed way. That's one way that queens are able to mediate. And it allows the king to show mercy without looking weak. But it must have had this different flavour because Catherine of Aragon herself is a foreigner, and so are some of her household. So I wondered about this. There's no real evidence to suggest that even within the household, there's this sudden, oh, you are other. But I wonder whether they must have felt extra foreign at certain points during the reign and have felt vulnerable, certainly in the city of London.
And were they able to bring part of their culture with them, or were they kind of forced to adopt English customs and English fashion and English ways of conducting themselves and way of living their lives?
A bit of both. It's part of the job, I suppose, of a foreign queen, ladies in waiting, to create peace between the two nations. And we do know there are various projects on early modern queens that shows that queens and their household coming into a foreign country were a big means of cultural exchange. We know that Catherine of Aragon and her household, for instance, they didn't... Okay, so there's a myth that they brought with them a particular kind of embroidery called blackwork, which is the black stitching that you see on like shirt collars and cuffs in a lot of portraits. It turns out they didn't bring it with them. We probably already had it. It was already quite a big phenomenon, but they definitely popularized it more because you start to see it way more in portraits from that point. So yeah, there are things that they bring with them. But there are ways in which their foreignness is mocked as well. So Thomas More says some really horrible and sometimes quite racist things about them when he sees some of the Spanish in the coronation procession or in the marriage procession when she's going through London to marry Arthur. It's one of those. And that might partly be because there are black people in her retinue, but also because they're wearing Spanish dress. So they're wearing black lace. And he thinks it just looks ragged and tattered. But actually, that is a particular Spanish form of dress. So, yeah, it could go both ways, I think. And there's probably a degree of changing on both sides. There's some indication that Spanish fashions did become fashionable in England. So Catherine of Aragon, like most queens, gives away some of her cast-off clothing, which sounds weird to us, but it's a great mark of honour to wear the queen's clothes. And there's at least one noblewoman who's given a pair of Spanish sleeves to wear. And the fact that they're described as Spanish suggests that everyone would have known that that was the fashion, and therefore that they belonged to the Queen. So yeah, there is an indication that some cultural things came here and stayed.
In terms of, relationships with the Queen and spreading their values, but also once they're married and they've left service, do these ladies in waiting remain devoted to their Queen as Maria de Salinas did, or do they often, as you've said already alluded to, change their allegiances?
Oh, it depends who's asking and when. Maria de Salinas did end up being particularly devoted to Catherine. So when Catherine was dying at Kimbolton Palace at the very end of 1535, Maria knows about this. She writes to Thomas Cromwell for permission to go and visit her. She doesn't get an answer, but she probably didn't actually wait for an answer. She just wrote the letter so that she could later say, well, look, I asked. But she gets on her horse and rides up there. And then when she gets near there, she either actually does fall off her horse into the mud or pretends to have done so and talks her way in, saying, look, you can have whatever you want, whatever passes you think I should have, but let me get dry by the fire first. And of course, once they let her in, that's it. She doesn't leave and they don't see her again. She vanishes into the Queen's rooms. And legend has it that Catherine of Aragon died in Maria's arms. We can't prove that, but Maria was almost certainly there when Catherine died. That level of loyalty is not seen super often, I guess. But it's not uncommon for former ladies in waiting to maintain that sense of loyalty to a former queen. Maria's not the only one who keeps in touch with Catherine of Aragon. After Catherine Parr dies, her best mate, Catherine Willoughby, Duchess of Suffolk, who actually is Maria de Salinas' daughter, the Duchess of Suffolk raises Catherine Parr's child with Thomas Seymour, at least until the child unfortunately dies at a few years old. But yeah, that's quite some undertaking as well.
And that connection from Maria de Salinas to Catherine Parr or Elizabeth Willoughby, it's incredibly interesting to see how there's family connections between the ladies in waiting. Is that something that's typical of this period, typical of the ladies in waiting for the Six Queens?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's partly how you end up as a lady in waiting in the first place. It's sheer nepotism, but at least they're honest about it. To get in, you need to know women who are already there. So daughters follow mothers, nieces follow aunts. It's pretty common, yeah.
As these women are looking after each other, bringing one another in or using those nepotism pathways to get others appointed, they're also having their own lives. They're getting pregnant, they're having families, they're getting married. Or how were ladies in waiting treated when they were pregnant? Did they share that experience with the rest of the ladies in waiting, or did they leave court and go home and go through that process with their families at home?
They stay at court quite often until they're quite pregnant, really. But then when it's time for a woman to give birth, she will leave court and go usually to her own home, but possibly to her mother's home or something like that, somewhere where she feels safe. And she will go into confinement in the same way that a queen does. So withdraw into a room that's been prepared to be kind of dark and warm, like a womb itself. And she'll stay there until the birth is complete. The timings are often a little bit ad hoc. They're aiming for about 6 weeks. But obviously, they weren't as exact about when conception had happened as we might be. And you can't predict whether a baby is going to come early or late. So, that was the aim, to stay in confinement for a while, give birth there with other women around you. But many noble women would give birth, recover, and then after a few months come back to service at court.
How did the queens react to that? Were they supportive? Did they give gifts to these ladies in waiting when they've had their children?
They are supportive because it's pretty standard, I think, and there are always ladies in waiting, called ladies in waiting in extraordinary, who can just pop in and kind of cover absences. But pregnancy and giving birth was a fact of female life in this period. It was what they were perceived to be for. That's what women are supposed to do. So yes, the Queen will periodically lose the married women around her because they're giving birth. It is quite common for her to be named as godmother of the children, and she will send a gift to the christening, and probably give a kind of a financial gift to the midwife sometimes who helped bring the baby into the world.
And this kind of support from queens to ladies in waiting to queens, it's not only extended to them being pregnant and having their children. In the later parts of Henry's reign, some queens also have affairs. So how do ladies in waiting work with their queens? Do they protect their queens? Do they throw them under the bus and look to secure their own future? How does that work within this cutthroat Tudor world?
I mean, a wise queen has no affairs because it's very difficult not to be caught. A queen is almost never alone. So if she wants to sleep with someone else, she's going to need the connivance of at least one lady in waiting. And as Catherine Howard's downfall showed in the early 1540s, the other women are going to notice that weird things are happening. So it seems to have been usual for women to have had access to the Queen's bedchamber whenever. So when Catherine starts to lock the door against them, they notice and they remember later that that was weird. They know whether she's stayed up really late because they're the ones who will help her go to bed. It's really difficult to do it without their connivance. And one woman does help Catherine to arrange liaisons with Thomas Culpeper, who's a gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber. And that's Jane Parker, Viscountess Rochford. I don't have a good answer. Even now, having written the book, I don't have a good answer for why she did what she did. I don't know why she helped Catherine Howard to do what her own sister-in-law Anne Boleyn had been accused of doing 5 years previously. Surely that would teach you that there is no good outcome here. And we don't know. Did she find out accidentally? Was she blackmailed to keep quiet? Who knows what was going on? Did she simply make some bad choices earlier on that then spiraled out of her control? I mean, maybe. I think as historians, we're not here to judge, really, are we? Who can know what that atmosphere was like? But she did help Catherine. And it was discovered, or at least some earlier affairs that Jane Parker had nothing to do with were discovered before Catherine became queen. And then Catherine herself let the later affair out of the bag when she was being questioned by Thomas Cranmer, and the investigation snowballed from there. Lots of women were questioned, and I think it's easy, again, to judge them harshly for giving up information. But I think as a woman, if you're faced by half the King's Council staring down their beards at you, demanding to know things, you're probably going to give up whatever you know to save your own skin, especially because ultimately your oath of service is to the king, not the queen. And that is what happens. And eventually even Jane, Viscountess Rochford, gives up whatever she knows as well. And she is executed alongside the queen.
And it's interesting yet again to see the ladies in waiting faced with having to manage loyalties to them, to their own lives, to their families, to their queen and their king. It's a very fascinating theme that I've seen throughout your book. But you know, how does the system develop from Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon right up until Catherine Parr? Because there's 6 queens there. There's 2 foreign queens. You know, various aristocratic levels within those queens as well. How does that system develop and evolve?
There is some evidence to suggest that for ladies in waiting, the position that you hold might change across the course of Henry's reign. When Catherine of Aragon is on the throne, it's a basic medieval system. There are 3 ranks. So you've got the ladies who are at the top, the highest rank, fewer of those, more of the sort of ladies and gentlewomen in between who are slightly lower aristocracy. And then you'll have a few chamberers at the bottom who are there to do the more menial tasks. And they're still of gentry status, but they're just not quite as exalted. At some point during Catherine of Aragon's tenure, you also start to get the 6 maids of honour, who are teenagers, usually about 16, who are at court almost as though they're at a finishing school to gain some social polish, make some good contacts, maybe make a marriage, maybe gain a career as a lady in waiting, because that does happen to some of them. And they are under the governance of the mother of the maids, who's there to make sure they behave themselves, basically. It stays that way most of the way through. Terminology can be a bit vague depending on who is making a list and for what purpose. It's a really frustrating thing about the Tudor Court, is that the same word might not be used twice. So trying to pin down what ranks there are at any given point can be quite difficult to do. But by Catherine Howard's tenure as Queen, there is some evidence that the ranks within the Queen's household have diversified a bit. And that's because the Privy Chamber has now become more important and more regulated. So you've got women who serve the Queen in the Privy Chamber, which is more exclusive and of a higher status than those who are serving her in just the Presence Chamber. But even then, I think lines must have been blurry about which women have access where, and it relies on the people on the doors knowing their faces and things like that.
It's a fascinating system to see develop and grow from almost the end of the medieval period to the beginning of that early modern period. Now, I have a final fun question for you, Nikki, as I do for all guests here on the History of Jackson podcast. Now, across your book, you mentioned so many different women, their roles in the Queen's households, their lives as ladies in waiting. And I was absolutely, personally, I was captivated by Maria de Salinas. But I wanted to ask you, who was your favourite lady in waiting that you wrote about within your book?
Oh, we're not supposed to have favourites, but it was Maria for me as well. And it was because I found stuff that we didn't know before. And so, and because it was letters, her character really just flew off the page. And she behaves in ways that I think an English noblewoman at the same time probably wouldn't have. She's really sassy. She tells her brother and her brother-in-law what to do and where to go quite frequently. And I think English women were perhaps less likely to do that, at least in written form, in letters at the same time. So she really stood out as such a strong character.
No, I think that's a great answer. And obviously finding those letters was rediscovering those letters, is, such a great thing for you to be able to bring to that book and be able to bring her back to life within the pages. Now, people listen to us discuss the waiting game for this episode, but how can they grab a copy of your new book?
It will be in your favourite bookstore or online retailer from Thursday, the 25th of April. So, grab it. There's an ebook, there's a hard copy, however you like to consume your history.
And the cover looks absolutely amazing.
Thanks. They did a great
job. From the post you posted, yeah. And then how can people interact with you and your work online, Nikki?
So I'm on Twitter at Nikki Clark 86. I do use Instagram, but mostly I use Twitter. So that's the best way to find out what I'm doing at any point.
Oh, fantastic. So I'll make sure there's a link for your book in the description below so people can go and grab a copy, but also a link for your social media so they can keep up to date with all the work that you're doing. But thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So thank you very much for listening to this newest episode of the History of Jackson podcast, where we spoke to Dr. Nicola Clark all about her brand new book, The Waiting Game, the untold story of the women who served the Queen. Now, I'm sure you can agree this is an absolutely fascinating episode, and to learn about an element, a facet of the Tudor Court life that we don't often touch on was amazing. And learning about that in such depth as Nicola brings to us was truly an honour, particularly as Nikki was one of my lecturers at uni. Now, if you enjoyed this episode or any other episodes that we have here at History of Jackson or any other content that we create here at History of Jackson, please do consider heading to the Buy Me a Coffee profile in the description below or heading to History of Jackson Plus on Apple Podcasts, where you can support us to continue to create the content that we do on a daily basis. Now, next Sunday, we've got another awesome episode lined up that I know you're going to absolutely love.